people who are just getting started, because that's definitely the case. We have people with all different experience levels in this group. So that's great. Well, so while I'm presenting, if everyone maybe wants to turn their mute on, just so we're not picking up any background noise, but if you have any questions or want to say anything at all, you can turn it right back on. But sometimes that makes it a little easier. So finishing art and other details. So I put this image here with this canvas with these edges up here on purpose, because I wanted to really quick before I get into this talk about something here, because I distinctly remember when I was in high school, my art teacher was just, ooh, you had to paint your edges and they needed to wrap around the canvas. She was so particular about that. And so I remember feeling a little rebellious and thinking, well, what if I don't want it to be exactly like that? What if I want it to have like a strip of color or something different? So I remember I just kind of play around with some different things. I remember I painted a canvas edge all black one time, or I kind of let some of the wash kind of like this just show through and leave it a little rough, because sometimes there's a quality to that that can be interesting. So I just thought I'd put that up because, you know, that was something I was taught when I was younger, is you finish those edges, you wrap it around, but you know, there could be other ways to do things. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. So Leonardo da Vinci declared more than 500 years ago that art is never finished, it's only abandoned. Nari Ward is a sculptor who does a lot of kind of recycling based art, says that art is never finished, it's merely repurposed. So I kind of thought those were interesting things to consider. So this whole idea of how do I know if my artwork is finished or not? And you know, that can look a lot of different ways, because sometimes we are drawing or sketching just for practice, just for sketching purposes, whereas sometimes we want something to look finished and completed, so we could give it away to someone as a gift, or we could hang it up on our wall, or put it in a gallery if we're an artist that likes to showcase things, or share a photo on our Facebook, or, you know, any reason that we might want art to be finished. There's always that kind of question of, how do I know? And like my own personal experience has been, oops, just a minute, we've got another person I'm going to let in. Cool, there we go. So in my own personal experience, you know, sometimes that's tricky. I've definitely just had art sitting in the corner for a long time, not knowing what to do with it. I have a timeout space in that closet behind me where I put some paintings and I turn them around and I just don't look at them for a while, you know. So I've definitely had those moments where I felt like stuck or sick of something, or not sure if it's done. I mean, I've definitely have been there before. So I thought I would go back to, what do I tell my students when they are questioning, am I done? Or they come up to me and tell me they're done. And I think in my head, no, you're not. There's so much more you could do, because I think that happens more often than not. And that could be coming from a little bit of impatience on their end. You know, when you're younger, sometimes you tend to rush to get something done instead of taking a break and coming back to it. You just, I'm done instead. So my advice for them, first and foremost, is to step away and look at your art from a distance. I think that's like the most important thing you can do. And I said that in my classes before, but just remember, when you're painting or drawing something, I mean, even on an easel, really, you're close to it. You are up close, you're staring at it, you're looking at it, and you're seeing it completely differently than somebody else. But then I think putting it up, maybe if it's a canvas, hang it up on the wall if you can, or prop it up on a shelf, or set it up on a table, whatever you can do, and step back from it and look at it from different angles, maybe squint at it, change the light a little bit. But sometimes that can just be really helpful for seeing your art from a different perspective. So I usually start there. And oftentimes in my own work, that tells me something right away. Like, yes, you need something else. This composition looks, empty, or something could go here, or, whatever it may be. Or even a line is slightly off, or a proportion in the face just isn't quite right. Sometimes tiny adjustments can make big differences. Another idea I've tried before is putting it upside down, or looking at it at a different angle, from a different angle, to see the composition. And, this of course could always work for abstract art. That might seem more common because, you could potentially look at it from all these different angles. But sometimes something even realistic, like a portrait or landscape, or animal, could be helpful to look at it from a totally different perspective. You can see the composition a little bit, and just, it might tell you something. It might give you some insight into what might need to be done, or that it looks good. And then I always say, try to ask 3 people their thoughts on your artwork if you can. I know that's always, sometimes it's difficult if you live alone, or you don't have 3 different people around you. But some things you could do would even be take a snapshot with your phone and send it off to someone and say, hey, what are your thoughts on this? Or maybe ask them some guiding questions, or even just leave it open-ended and see what their response is. I know sometimes people just tend to say, oh, that looks great. But, I think sometimes it's okay to be specific on the type of feedback if that's what you want, because feedback from other people, seeing it outside of our own perspective, they can help inform and help us see things that we might not. So that's something I always like to try to do. And I do it with my own artwork too. I think sharing is how we grow. And sorry, there goes my Siri. She likes to go off on me when I'm presenting. I need to write that down on my note. I need to turn her off. I'm not sure what it is, but she always thinks I'm talking to her. All right, so my friend Annie is a art teacher. She was an art teacher in North Carolina, but now she lives in Ohio, in Cleveland. So I was chatting with her on the phone yesterday, actually, after our week of teaching. And I said to her, Annie, what is your number one kind of piece of advice or thing you think about when you're finished with an artwork? And she told me, for her own art, she feels like she just kind of knows. She's gotten to a point where she feels like she just kind of knows. And she says she's gotten to that point because she realized she would start overworking things and actually taking away from the art instead of making it better. And she said she would get to that point where she felt like she's taking away from it. She wasn't making it better. So her biggest piece of advice is avoid overworking. You can get to a point where it's too much, and you should maybe step back a little bit. I put on here too, referring to photos of earlier stages could sometimes help you. That's why I like to take pictures of my work in progress as I go. Because then when I've made a bunch of additional layers, I can look back to a previous layer. And sometimes that helps put it into perspective for me too. And I'm like, oh yeah, this does actually look finished, especially when I look at it compared to what it looked like, several hours ago. So Carrie Lewis is an artist, and I pulled some tips from her. I thought it was very interesting. I'll show you a few websites that I found some great articles. There are a lot of different articles on this whole idea. And so I thought it was kind of interesting to pull some different ideas. So Carrie Lewis says, know the goal for the drawing. And I like this idea because you could think back to, okay, Are you just trying to sketch something so that you can practice? Then maybe finishing it or spending more than an hour or two on it isn't even worth your time. But again, if your goal is to, produce and render a full acrylic painting from start to finish, then that's a different goal where you do want to think about, okay, how can I finish this? This whole idea of self-evaluation, I think, is sometimes difficult but important. And I think, obviously when it comes to art, we are our worst critic, right? And we often see things that other people don't see. But I like this idea of a self-evaluation process. It's something like I'd give my students would look like a rubric with a checklist, or it would look like a self-reflection, like written, like what do you really enjoy about your art? What did you struggle with? Because you as the artist know, I think, better than anyone, the areas that were challenging for you versus what, came kind of natural or you feel really good about, the areas you enjoy the most. So I think holding yourself kind of to that standard and say, okay, my shading, for example, I really want to work on the application of the graphite. I want it to be really soft instead of seeing, directional lines perhaps. So that could be a way of self-evaluation. When you look at your drawing, you kind of go back to those goals and ask yourself, well, did I meet that goal? And if you didn't, what could you do? And it's like, I think that's a good life lesson too, but a good thing you can apply to your art. Does it look good in person and on the computer? This is something I think is super helpful. Again, taking photos of your artwork, put it on your computer, look at it on the screen. How does it look now when you're seeing it in this way, especially now in this virtual world when we are sharing a lot of stuff digitally? And then does it look like the reference photo, which not always, because sometimes we don't use reference photos. Sometimes it's abstract. Sometimes it's a stylized version of a reference photo. But, think about, again, going back to your goals, perhaps you wanted to capture all the values of a portrait you took from a photo. So that could be an example. Did you match all those values? Or if you are trying to do something photorealistic, did you capture all the information from the photo and put that into your drawing? And this is maybe my favorite one. You just don't know what else to do with it. And sometimes we get to that point. You're at a loss. You're like, I don't know what to do with this. And you've kind of run through everything else. Maybe it's just done at that point. And that's okay. So in some of my looking into this kind of idea, because now I'm like, I am intrigued, and I think I'm going to start asking all these different artists, like, how do you know? How do you know? And see what they all say. I think it's interesting. So Emilio Perez, comes from an Art News article, and I am sharing it. So I will share this slideshow with you all and give you a link to it, but there's a link to this Art News article. And I like this idea. Of course, he is doing a little bit of a different process. He makes paintings, which I'll show you on the next slide what they look like. Through a process of subtraction, he cuts into the canvas and exposes layers of colors underneath. And so he thinks of it as a conversation, right? Like when you have a conversation, a really great conversation with someone, it just ends in a natural way. The conversation, it can't last forever and ever and ever, just like artwork, right? It naturally ends. And he sort of listens to his intuition, not putting much pressure on yourself. And this idea, if you mess it up, you can always make another one, right? Because it's art. And so we can always make more. We learn from our first or second or third or fourth attempts through something. And this is his art here. So you can see all these colors. So it's not like it's super deep that he cuts through, you know, it's still fairly thin, but it'd be interesting to see it in person. I like how big they are too. But yeah, I linked that article. So if you'd like to read the full article, I thought it was a good read. Interesting. And there's lots of different artists' takes within the article. So I have a little video. It's like a little 6-minute video that I thought would be fun to share with you all. And it's some different college art professors kind of who are also artists talking about their sort of process on how to know when your art is finished.
I feel like whenever I'm working on a drawing, the first 3 quarters...
Just want to make sure. Could you hear it okay? Okay, great.
I feel like whenever I'm working on a drawing, the first 3 quarters of it is relatively easy because you know what to do. It's obvious. Like if I'm drawing a portrait and the nose is really fuzzy and undefined, I know I got to go in and put in a shadow. I know I have to make the highlights stronger. That's very straightforward. And I think it's when you get to that like last 10% when I go, shoot, what do I do now? You don't want to do too much because you worry that you're going to over labor it. But then you think, what if I stop too early? Then it looks unfinished. So for me, it's so ambiguous and it drives me up the wall.
I'm actually quite the opposite. I find the hardest part for me is the beginning because I plan so thoroughly and I think through it that if I don't get started, like it's hard for me to get started essentially. And once I get rolling, I can just finish it.
But how can you be so definitive about I'm done?
When you work with 3-dimensional work like jewelry, you kind of get to a point where there's not much more you can actually do to it.
Is that because of the limitation of the material? Because the metal just won't do more?
Yeah, I polished it to where I need to. I mean, sometimes getting the right finish on the metal is actually kind of hard to determine. So I'll either take a step away from it and then come back and see if it needs anything else, because when you're staring at something for hours, it gets challenging, or I will ask for a second opinion.
I've sort of set up my entire artistic process as a cartoonist to combat that, because cartooning is broken up into stages where you do the thumbnail sketches, then you do pencils, then you do inks. If you're doing a color comic, you color it. I do my professional illustrations the same way. I can kind of figure out when I'm done at each stage. The real problem, though, is when you get to that last stage, when I have the inks finished. If I don't like them, I can spend days like fiddling with them in Photoshop or like cleaning them up with white gouache. I get very nitpicky, so it's easy for me to just fix my line work until it looks dead and horrible.
One of the signals to me that I'm almost finished is when I'm not really making any changes. I'm just doing a little here, a little there, and nothing's really happening.
Yeah.
I just want to keep working on it, but sometimes nothing's really improving or changing very much.
There have definitely been pieces where I've spent too much time fixing things and my brushwork starts to look dead. And like a lot of people think that I do a lot of my work on the computer, which isn't true. It's just that I get really crazy. Why would you work in ink if you didn't get some of that nice brush quality?
The imperfect is almost in right now. That obviously handmade look that you see with all the pottery.
There's something so nice about the quality of just a mark that's made with no fuss. And I do make those marks. It's just I then go back in with gouache and ruin those marks. The thing that really I can spend a lot of time on, especially my professional illustration work, that takes me so long to do is like the color. I was someone that was so afraid of color for so long, and then found that when I entered the professional illustration industry, people want color, so I have to figure that out, especially coloring in Photoshop where you can just change things really easily.
Oh, endlessly.
It'll take me a day to finish coloring a piece.
Maybe the material that you're working in to a certain degree determines how fussy or not fussy you are. Because the thing is, I work in drawing a lot, but I also do a lot of printmaking. And the thing is, when you have a printing press and you roll something through the press and then you pull this piece of paper off, there's this like flourish in the end. You know that thing in the Olympics where the gymnasts like put their arms up because they like finished a routine? I feel like that's what printmaking is like, because you pull the paper off and like, I'm done. And the thing is, in drawing, I can always go back. And in painting, it's the same way. You can always do more. But I rarely do more to the actual print. Like I may go back and rework a plate and maybe adjust things, but printmaking doesn't give me the same problems that drawing does. With drawing, I'm running around in circles and I'm questioning myself. And sometimes to me, the point that I stop is like, I can't just look at this anymore. I'm just so sick of it. I'm like, done. I just walk away, which doesn't sound very romantic or resolved, but I think it just gets to a point like that sometimes.
Yeah.
Like when you are working on it and you're not really adding anything anymore or changing anything that anybody can actually notice besides you is when I would say I need to stop on something.
There's definitely a point that I always reach with a piece that I've been working on for too long where I just want to run away from it. I just hate it so much. And that's usually for me when I know that I'm done.
Do you ever go back to it? Like, do you ever say, oh my God, I can't stand this, wait a few weeks and then go back? Or is it just, you're gone?
It's so much easier to have a deadline than to just be working on personal work for that reason, because you could always keep perfecting that personal work.
I was talking about how easy it is for me to finish a piece, but it's so challenging to know when I'm done planning for a piece, when I'm ready to stop making models, stop making mock-ups and just go for it. Because at some point, you need something physical. You can't just turn in theoretical work.
If I don't do the proper amount of planning on the front end of the process, I have to spend more time being nitpicky at the end of the process because I have to fix everything that I didn't plan out that well.
I feel like being too set on a plan doesn't leave room to adjust if it's not working. So it's always good to maybe have a general direction and have a lot of things planned out, but if it's not working, don't be afraid to then alter when necessary.
Sometimes I think it just comes down to you kind of have to give yourself a time limit. Sometimes just stepping away from it, coming back to it and looking at it, you can tell immediately whether or not it's done.
I need a sarcastic mark now.
Okay, sarcastic mark. You. No, in front of your face. It sounded like it hurt.
Got it. Oops. I just loved how she had, did you notice a little bit of charcoal on her cheek during the interview? I'm like, I love it. It's so great. So signing your artwork, of course, is a component to finishing your artwork. So I wanted to, traditionally, because, in the art world, there's so much tradition, of course, with a lot of, uprising to said tradition, but traditionally, you sign the artwork in the medium that you used. So if it's an oil painting, you sign it with oil paint and your brush. If it's a graphite drawing, you sign with graphite. That's kind of the traditional way to do it. Now, there's some other methods. For example, I've actually, like with an acrylic painting, I've scratched my name into it, etched it essentially, like a sgraffito kind of style. I've done that before. I've used paint pens before, so it's a little bit cleaner. I'll be honest, I don't know that I have one particular signature, so I think it might be fun to figure that out or kind of pick one for myself based on, some of what I kind of, dug up on signing artwork too. So one kind of tip, especially for painting, this is a kind of a pro tip, is signing your painting right after you finish it. This will help your signature blend in with the rest of the painting instead of waiting for your painting to dry and then putting your signature on like it's added on later. It also said collectors prefer paintings where the signature was added at that time because it's harder to forge a signature because it's done at the time of a painting, which kind of makes sense, sort of etched into it or painted in a very similar manner. Consider the year you made the work. That is something I've liked to consider about adding a year. It could be something though, like you're seeing on the bottom, that you're adding it to the back. It doesn't necessarily always have to be on the front. I've definitely signed some with the date, some without. Something like printmaking, for example, and I should have put an example of signing a print, but for signing a print, when you're printmaking, there's a very particular way to sign a print because you are typically running an edition. So you have a limited number of prints. So you sign each one, kind of like you see at the bottom, how it looks 1/1. That's kind of how you'd sign a print, 1/, however many in the edition. Could be 50, could be 6, depends how many you pulled. And you always sign in pencil with printmaking. So there are some different little kind of things like that. But again, I think it always goes to, you can do what you want, but there's sort of like the tradition and expectation too. Some kind of tips for signing your art. Again, these are things that I found and kind of advice that is kind of the general consensus in the art world. Consider not using your regular signature, so not necessarily the one that you sign a letter or, you know, sign a form or a check or whatever. Maybe you have something that's particular for your art. Is that don't be a scribbler. And I think the idea behind that is you want to see what the name is, especially if you're trying to sell art or put your art in a gallery eventually. You want to be able to see what the name is. And I think you need to decide, do you want it to be your full name, initials, your surname? I mean, you can kind of decide what you want your signature to be. This idea that the signature is your brand. And I think too, it's of course not all artists sell their work or show their work. I mean, that's not necessarily something you have to do, but if that's something you're interested in, then knowing that that's part of your brand is important. And then perhaps this idea of designing your signature. I mean, think about this. As artists, we're designing our art, we're creating art. There's no reason to not design a signature. A lot of artists did that. I loved Andy Warhol's signature, by the way, because what I heard was he had his mom do it in the early years. His mom signed his stuff for him. So, you know, who knows if that's 100% true, but I always thought that was kind of funny. Again, your signature is your logo. I think that kind of goes along with the idea it's your brand, that goes together. This idea that practice makes perfect, be tidy and consistent, cheat if you have to. Here's what that means. It means if you have, let's say, a certain way you want to sign your name every time, you can have that on a little piece of paper and then use carbon paper or transfer it onto the surface so it's consistent every time, almost like a stamp. And then where to place the signature. You know, there's different advice for where to place it. I think most common is one of the lower left or right hand corners, depending on what you've painted. But there could be other places. I just actually noticed we have in our staff bathroom in the art hall, we have a Bob Ross painting on the wall. And he kind of signed the one that he signed his name in red paint. And it was like to the middle left, just in the middle of the painting. So it's like, there are different places you could sign it based on a particular painting, but a couple things to consider. One, most people are going to look in the lower right hand or left hand corners. So you don't want to make them hunt for a signature if they're looking for one. And two, you don't want the signature to like take over a part of your art or start to become necessarily a piece of it, you know. So sealing a painting, I want to talk about this too, because another component to finishing our painting is, of course, deciding if it's done, signing it, but then what about protecting it? Like that kind of next step. So sealing a painting, essentially what that means is you're varnishing a painting. So you can varnish an acrylic painting, you can varnish an oil painting, and that's essentially you're putting a protective seal or coat over your painting. There are different types of finishes and mediums you can use to do this. The most obvious says varnish right on it, but it is possible to use some other types of mediums in lieu of actual varnish, especially with acrylic, because the properties of acrylic is it seals it. Once something has been painted with acrylic, it's essentially like waterproof. But then the whole idea of, actually I should have done this one. I'm going to go back. But like, why would you even want to seal it? Like, what's the point? Is it's going to make your painting last longer. And because you're protecting it from dust, debris, fading from UV rays if you've got sun coming in. And I will tell you, we have artwork hanging all over the walls of the high school I work at with tons of big windows. And there's a whole wall of paintings and drawings that have turned and faded blue. They have faded completely blue. They look monochromatic now. And a couple of them actually, I mean, they still look nice. Like a couple of them looks like, hey, they could have worked like that. But the color was fully gone because nothing was sealed or protected. So that Colorado sunshine coming in all day, beating on that artwork caused that to happen within like under a 10-year span for most of them. So going back just a couple slides here, there are different finishes for varnishes. So you can have glossy, satin, matte. That's typically going to be your main options. Glossy is going to really make it shiny, and it's going to make those colors pop. It's going to be the most vibrant option. So if you're wanting your painting to be very vibrant and colorful, glossy is a great option. Satin and matte varnishes are going to create less glare, meaning reflective, light coming in through windows. If you're to snap a picture of it and your flash accidentally went off, the gloss is obviously going to produce much more of a glare than the satin or matte finish. The matte varnish will lighten darker colors. So if that appeals to you, you could choose that as an option. Matte varnish is very, very flat, and a satin is kind of like in between. So it gives you kind of like a couple levels to choose from. And what I put here on the bottom is you can mix these to create your own, like what you want your painting to look like, to create your own level. So like, let's say you start with some satin, but you're like, I just want a little bit more glossy because I want my colors to pop a little bit more. You could mix a little gloss varnish with satin varnish. And you can also layer varnishes to alter how it looks in the end. I think, the first time you varnish something is a little scary, especially if you have a painting that you love, because you're like, what's it going to look like? So I think it's almost good to test varnish, maybe do a couple little mini paintings or layer some colors or just do a few swatches and then try varnish and see what it looks like with, your little tests. That can be a good idea. But this is an example. So this is an oil painting. So on the left is before the varnish, on the right is after the varnish. And that's probably going to be gloss or maybe satin. But you can tell like it makes it much more vibrant. So it's just important to consider that it is going to change how your painting looks in the end. So I think, it's good to think about that. Oops. And then sealing a drawing. So in the drawing world, you would fix a drawing with fixative spray. And this is typically going to be for any type of dry medium, like your charcoal, graphite, pastel, anything like that. You can use a fixative spray. Typically, it'll say like workable fixative on it, which what that would mean is, I'll just use a charcoal drawing, for example. Let's say you're drawing with charcoal and you're doing some blending and you don't want it to blend too much anymore. So you can spray part of it to stop it from smudging and then keep working and adding more charcoal. The other thing fixative does for a drawing, it's something I've learned a little bit more recently. It can actually increase like the tooth essentially of the paper. Like let's say you're working with colored pencil and you feel like it's not layering or adding any more color. You can spray with fixative and then keep adding more color pencil, and it should help you build up those layers. So that's one thing you can do. Another DIY version is actually like Aquanet hairspray. You can use that in the aerosol can from, the grocery store or wherever. But that will work too. But I usually, Fixative, I've gotten it sent to me on Amazon. It's usually about $5 or $6 for a can and will last you a long time. And then I linked this article because I just thought this was a great article on titling an artwork.
Question for you.
Yeah.
Back up a bit.
Yeah.
I'm working more with gouache.
Yes.
What's the best way to fix gouache?
Good question. So the best way to fix gouache, let me see if I've got my stuff in here that I use. I used just a clear polyurethane coat in an aerosol can. I got this, actually this one said it came from Hobby Lobby, but I know you can get it at Lowe's, Home Depot, I think Walmart.
Is it flat?
Say that again?
It's a flat finish?
This is a flat finish.
Okay.
Yeah,
because
different finishes.
Most of the gouache are fairly thin, and so I don't worry about them. This one is really thick, and
Yes.
I worry about the paint cracking.
Yes.
It's not fixed.
Yes. The other thing you can use, Susan, would be an acrylic matte spray. They would make like an acrylic matte spray, and you could spray that over the gouache, and it would keep more of the matteness of the gouache, because that's sometimes you use gouache because you want the matte colors.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can send you some links if you let me know if you have trouble finding something.
I just want to say, do it outside.
Oh yeah, Carol, that's great advice. Yeah, spray
I'll kill
outside if
myself
you
this
can.
time.
Yeah, fixatives are pretty strong with the fumes. Varnish, I mean, honestly can be sometimes too, depending on what you're using, but anything like an aerosol can, I definitely recommend going outside. Unless you have access to a really good ventilation fan system, but even in my classroom, I don't have a spray booth. I send the students outside and they go spray things outside. We have a rock area. I say, go lay your thing on the rocks and spray. So they have a little system. So titling your artwork, I linked a little thing about titling. Now, it's kind of one of those things, some things that we do like sketches and little drawings or practice pieces aren't necessarily things that we need to title maybe any more than like a description, like, simple bottle still life or something, or, kind of describe what it is that you did. But I remember when I was in high school, when I had to turn in art, my high school art teacher made us come up with 5 titles for every artwork we turned in, and I couldn't stand it. I remember I like rebelled in college and wanted to just call everything Untitled. I was like, I just don't know, Untitled. But, now thinking about this idea of titles, I think it's important to think about in the terms of when we have a piece that we've poured a lot into, or maybe there's a conceptual component to it, or some meaning behind it. Titles can clue a viewer into something about the artwork, right? Like if you go to an art museum or a gallery and you read the label, there's some information about the artwork that can clue you into a little bit about its meaning or its intention or what the artist was thinking. It's a way to connect. So, I don't think titling something is always necessary. I don't title a lot of what I do, but some things I choose to. And, if you're choosing to share digitally, which is this kind of next slide, I kind of had this thought before class, and I just didn't know if anyone was interested in making like a little portfolio to showcase their growth and their art that they've made. So, I mean, if that is something you're interested, I'd be happy to teach a little class on how to set that up. But photographing your art so you have digital files can be helpful because you could make digital art prints, you could post your work to a website, share your artwork on Facebook or an art group, which can be, I think, really good, and it's a good way to grow. And I think if you are sharing your work, oftentimes it's good to have a title because, like I said, it kind of cues someone into what's going on. And even if it's a kind of a descriptive title, or if you painted a portrait of your pet and it's just your pet's name, something like that can just, too, I think, make something feel completed. It's got a title, it's signed, it's sealed, it's finished, and you know that. Oh, so that is the end of my, oh, you know what, real quick before I do that, I just wanted to, this is the one Lee gave me that I wanted to share with you all, with asking, is my painting finished? And I love this, going back to intention, right? Because we kind of talked about, okay, well, what's the purpose of your drawing, that intention. And I love the questions that are here, just kind of thinking of some guiding questions that you could get used to asking yourself. Composition, I think even going back to basic elements of art and principles of design, asking yourself, did I lay out the composition nicely? Bringing into color into that and value into that. Those are elements of art, right? So asking questions based on the elements, I think, are really good. And asking yourself these things could maybe help you decide if it's finished, but then also how it's coming across to a viewer who might be looking at your artwork. And then I like the accuracy component, right? Because for some of us, that's what we're trying to do. We are trying to draw accurately, especially if it's perspective or a realistic drawing. We want some of that stuff. Again, texture would be an element of art. Going back to asking yourself about those elements. And then I love these kind of beauty and music questions too. And I love this end, do I need to? Because I think you could always ask yourself that at the end of everything. Well, do I need to? And I love this idea of beauty too. I'll ask my high school students this. I'm like, well, does art have to be beautiful? Or this idea of what makes something beautiful is so different to each individual person. So I think, that's interesting to think about. So I can share that all with you too. And then of course the feedback, right? Which we kind of talked about as well, but asking someone what they think. And I think it's interesting asking someone who is an artist, their perspective, versus someone who maybe doesn't practice art, to hear their opinion, because not everyone who looks at what we do has an artistic background.